As you just heard, we are being recorded. So I'm going to start moving through. Now, as we go through this, I just want you to know that this bill came out yesterday. It's got its second reading today. So basically, I sat up last night reading this thing and hopefully are bringing you all the information that you need. Now, as we move through the presentation, if you've got any questions, either put your hand up and we'll get you unmuted, or pop them in the chat box. Now, please do this as we move through the slides. Don't wait until there's a section for questions, because sometimes it's a lot easier to answer your questions while we're in the moment, rather than having to go back maybe 10 or 15 slides to get to the point. So any questions, please do pop them into the chat box. So for those of you that have just joined us, if you want a recording or a link to the recording, then please do pop your email address into the chat box. Jen, you said you've got no sound, but everybody else is able to hear me to put their email address into the chat box. So I don't know if it's just you that's got no sound. I think everybody else can hear. Anyway, if you pop your email address into the chat box, I'll be able to send you a copy of this anyway, which hopefully will have the sound on it. So let's get moving. So what do we know so far? So what we do know, and what I can confirm is 100% going to happen, is the removal of Section 21. Now, most of us just know Section 21 as a no-fault eviction notice, but actually it's Section 21 of the Housing Act 1988. This is going to be removed. What this will mean is that there will no longer be assured short-hold tenancies. So Section 21 actually makes assured short-hold tenancies. So the removal of that means we no longer have ASTs. What does that mean? Well, that means we will just go back to the old-fashioned way of doing things before the 1988 Act came in, and we will then just simply have assured tenancies. So not a huge amount is going to change. So I would just say, do not panic too much, okay? So I'm just, for those that are joining us now, if you want a copy or a link to a copy of this, please just put your email address into the chat box and I can send you a link. So don't worry, we're only on the first slide, those who have just joined us, so panic not. So yeah, removal of Section 21. So we're going to have no more assured short-hold tenancies. They're also abolishing the ability to give fixed term tenancy agreements. So basically this means that all tenancy agreements will be periodic from day one. The period must not be any longer than 1 month. Now, what this means is some landlords, letting agents will put a tenancy agreement in place where there's a fixed term, where the rent is paid every 3 months, so every quarter, or maybe every 6 months. That's going to go in the shredder. That can't happen anymore. If you want tenants to pay rent in advance, absolutely, you can. That's not going to be abolished. But the ability to actually have it written in so that they are quarterly or 6 monthly tenancies is no longer going to be possible. So what we'll be looking at is every new tenancy will literally be month by month periodic. For existing tenancies that have those clauses where rent is paid every 3 months, what will happen is when we get to the transitional period, and I will talk about that in more detail as we move through, what will actually happen is let's say it's 3 months, that 3-month period will be recalculated via a formula that is inputted into the Renters Reform Bill, and it will be calculated on a 28 days a month basis. I'm not going to worry about looking at the calculations now, because it's very possible that might change, or it may be amended, or something along those lines. So the reason that I'm talking about what I'm talking about today is because those are the things that we know. However, a lot of things could change. So one thing that you'll probably hear a lot of the experts talk about from this point onwards are Henry VIII clauses. Now, what this means is Henry VIII himself as we all know, loved to change legislation as and when he felt like it, including when he wanted to get divorced. But this means that if somebody wants to change a current act of Parliament and they don't want to have to go through the rigmarole of having it read in the House of Lords, having it read in the House of Commons and going through a full process, they can use a clause called a Henry VIII clause, which basically means they can amend a subordinate piece of legislation. So anything that is less than a law, and we'll see a lot of this with the Renters Reform Bill. So it's just for you to understand what that clause means and how it's going to be implemented. So let's start with rent increases. Now, at the moment, when you want to increase rent, what you would do is issue your tenant normally a Section 13 notice, and you'd give them 1 month's notice in line with rent due date. That's been slightly tweaked, and now you'll have to give 2 months' notice. Increase can only happen once every year. We have that anyway. That's always been under Section 13. Rent can only be increased yearly, so no change there. And the tenant can apply to the first tier tribunal to appeal the rent increase if they don't agree with it. And again, that's something we've already got in existence. A lot of tenants aren't aware that they have that. And obviously now with 2 months' notice coming in, the tenants will have a longer period of time to be able to put that application in. Now, what the first tier tribunal will do is they will look at the rent that's been proposed, and they'll look at the current rent that the tenant is paying, and they'll also look at market rent. And that is where the tribunal will make their decision, is if the rent proposed is in line with market rent. Now, where the bill at the moment is rather unhelpful is it doesn't tell us where they're going to get the information from to determine what or who is giving us that market rent. Normally, if somebody says to me, where are you getting that information from? My first place to look is the rental price index, because that's a really good look at where rents are at that particular time. You can look at rents going back in history to see how quickly and how much the increments have gone up. So the rental price index is always a good starting point. But for this particular part of the bill, we don't know where they're going to be getting their market value from. Now, this is the bit that everyone's worrying about, and that's pets in property. So at the moment, as a landlord, if your tenant asks you nicely if they can have a pet, you can say nicely no if you want to, or you can agree to a pet and everybody carries on as normal. So what's going to happen with the bill is it's actually going to be an implied term in the tenancy agreements. So what this means is it's going to be assumed that the tenant can have a pet. However, the tenant must still ask permission to keep a pet. That permission request must be in writing to the landlord, and the landlord can't, as is now, unreasonably refuse that request. Now, what is nice this time is we're giving some time limits. So a landlord will have 41 days to respond to that written request. Within that time, the landlord can ask for more information about the pet, such as type of pet, maybe breed, anything along those lines that would help the landlord make a decision. Because let's face it, if your tenant turns around and says, I'd really like a dog, and you say, that's great, it's a 1-bedroom flat and the dog turns out to be a Great Dane, that's not going to work. So there's nothing stopping the landlord asking for more information to help them make an informed decision on having a pet. Now, what I was really pleased to see come in with the bill is that tenants must have pet damage insurance. Now, this is only if the landlord puts it in writing that this is a request that they want. If the landlord doesn't make that request, then the tenant doesn't have to have that insurance. Now, at the moment, under the Tenant Fees Act 2019, if you ask a tenant to pay for something from a third party, such as pet insurance, this would be a prohibited fee. However, this new bill amends that little bit of the Act and allows landlords to specifically ask a tenant to buy pet insurance or pay the landlord's additional uplift of their insurance if that then covers pets. I have a Question. Melinda, some leasehold properties do not allow pets in the lease. Is this changing? No, it isn't. However, that would be your reason to refuse. So if, for example, having a pet in the property would breach the lease that the landlord's got on the property, that's a very good reason to refuse, and there's nothing that the tenant can do about that. Again, if you happen to live in a certain type of property where they just ban pets outright, again, perfectly acceptable reason for landlord to refuse. So no, leaseholds won't be changing their terms and conditions, but it will be a very valid reason, and it will be part of the Renters Reform Bill to allow landlords to refuse a pet. Hope that answers your question. So interestingly, in this particular bill, tenancy agreements now must be in writing. Now, at the moment, a tenancy agreement of less than 3 years doesn't actually legally have to be in writing. It can be verbal. And as long as rent is paid and rent is received, a tenancy agreement is formed. However, with the bill, the proposal is tenancy agreements must be in writing. This written agreement doesn't have to be in a formal form of any description. It can literally be a piece of paper where you agree the start date, tenant's name, landlord's name, rent, and off you go. It can be as simple as that. However, it's always better to have it as an actual written tenancy agreement. Now, failure to give a written tenancy agreement before the tenancy starts means you won't be able to gain possession under some of the new grounds that are being proposed. Don't worry, I'm going to go through all of the new grounds separately. And it'll actually carry a £5,000 fine if you don't give a written tenancy agreement. Again, what I need to reiterate here is this is the first draft of this bill. We've got the second reading of it today. It could all change. So don't think this is coming in and this is happening now. I'm going to go through timelines in a little bit further down this presentation. Written statement. Now, this is something we've not seen in English law before. So any of you that follow the press and the industry quite closely will know in December last year, Wales had a complete upheaval of their rental process and they had new legislation that came in. Part of that legislation was that landlords have to give their tenants a written statement. That written statement basically is just a piece of paper that explains the differences between the old tenancy and the new tenancy. So what you'd be doing is predominantly giving these for existing tenancies that are going to be affected by the new legislation. What we expect to see is the written statement is going to be in a prescribed form. That means it won't be possible to just do it on a piece of paper or an email to your tenant. It will have to be in a prescribed form. That, as always, will be drafted by the Secretary of State and will be available on the government website. Now, again, we're a long way off from there, so don't panic. This is just what's going to be happening once the bill becomes an act. Again, if you don't do this written statement, you can't gain possession under certain grounds. And like I say, I'm going to go through the grounds in more detail. And again, this one carries a £5,000 fine. Just before we move on, a few more people have joined us. So just to advise you, this is being recorded. If you don't want to be here or you shouldn't be here, I suggest you leave. And if you'd like to get a copy of the recording, please pop your email address into the chat box and I'll make sure a link is sent to you to the YouTube channel where this is going to be uploaded. Thank you. So misuse or incorrect notice, there's going to be a fine. Now, what does this mean? So basically, I'm going to go through in a moment the different grounds that have been brought in under the Act. It's not an Act yet, sorry, under the bill, slip of the tongue. And if a landlord issues a notice, a Section 8 notice to a tenant, using grounds that he knows he shouldn't really rely on, or not using the correct prescribed form, a landlord obviously won't be able to move forward with the eviction, but will be liable to get a fine of up to £5,000. And if the landlord keeps making the same mistake, landlord or letting agent, to be honest with you, is making the same mistake, then within the 5-year period of that mistake, they could get up to a £30,000 fine. So it's really important when this bill becomes an act that you're looking at getting the correct paperwork in place. So let's move on to tenants' notice now and what's changed for them. So at the moment, when a tenant is in a fixed term tenancy, they can't really give notice because they're in a fixed term, they're in a contract, they can't go. Tenants do not have to give notice if they want to leave at the end of a fixed term. There's no legal requirement to give notice, but it's nice if they do because then we all know what's going on. However, once it moves into periodic, tenants only need to give 1 month's notice in line with their rent due date. Now, what the bill is proposing is that tenants will be able to give 2 months' notice at any point from the day of move-in. And I have had this clarified, and yes, that literally means if they move in at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, they can give you notice at 5 past, and it will be valid. So they have to give 2 months' notice. The notice must be in writing and it must be visible. Now, I interpret this, because we've got nothing to help us explain this, that this means a tenant can give notice via email, text message, WhatsApp, or maybe even carrier pigeon. But like I say, I haven't had clarification on what visible in writing means. But this does amend the Protection from Eviction Act of 1977, which sets out that a tenant must give 1 month's notice in writing in line with their rent due. So what we're losing in this is the tenant doesn't have to do it in line with their rent due date, and there is no lapsing period. So the tenant doesn't have to wait a certain period of time before they have to give their notice. They can literally give it 5 minutes after they've moved into the property. Tenants can give less than 2 months' notice, but that's only with mutual agreement with the landlord. Notice to quit from the tenant, so the tenant's notice cannot be withdrawn unless with mutual agreement from the landlord. So again, a bit of safety there for the landlords. And also, I'd just like to add to that, including the fact that this is available now. If your tenant gives notice and they don't move out on the day that they say they're going to move out, and that scuppers your plans, you can actually charge them double rent. And that's under Section 18 of the Distress for Rent Act 1737. Yes, we are still using laws that old, but it does give you the right to charge them double rent on a daily basis if they fail to vacate on the day that they told you they were vacating. Tenancy deposits, there's no change with that. So deposits still need to be protected. If you haven't protected them within the correct amount of time, you won't be able to use a Section 8 notice. So all the things that we know and understand with regards to deposits and Section 21 simply just move along to the new Section 8. So nothing changes with deposits, that all remains the same. So just for those that have joined us, this is being recorded. If you wish to have a recording, please pop your email address into the chat box. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat box too. Like I've said, it's easier to do it whilst I'm in the moment rather than wait until the end of the presentation and I have to go back for like 15 slides. So trying just to keep the questions on point rather than going through. So don't worry about interrupting me. I'm more than happy to answer a question as we're moving through. So interestingly for me was the introduction of a property database. Now, we heard about a property portal, and again, not a lot has been said about the portal itself, but the property database is going to be introduced. And again, not a lot of detail on this. But what we do know is this database will be mandatory, so landlords will have to be part of this database. It will hold the landlord's details, property information, safety certificates, so that's like your gas certificate, your EPC, your EICR, your HMO license, that'll all go on there. If the landlord has had any offences, fines or penalties, that'll all be on the database. It will be public, and the bill is a little ambiguous as to whether it's going to be free or whether there's going to be a fee. Again, we're waiting for clarification on that. But what is clear is the details on the database must be kept up to date by the landlord. A landlord won't be able to advertise or market a property if they're not on the database and the information is out of date. All adverts for the property must include the unique database number. And there we are again, failing to do so. And there's your £5,000 fine again. Landlord redress. Again, this was something we were expecting, so nothing new. Just making sure I've got a couple of questions. Jen, okay, question. Who adds the fines to the database? So that would be the local authority. This is one of the ones that the local authority has been passed the duty to uphold. So each council will maintain their area. This is my understanding of the database. So they'll have access to their particular geographical area and they'll be making sure that everything is up to date. But ultimately, it's the landlord's responsibility to make sure that his property details are up to date. Melinda, if an agent manages a property for you, do they do the database for you? I think that should be a yes, but again, the bill itself is quite sparse on that specific information. And again, I think it would determine then what's written into the terms of business with the letting agent. Ideally, yes, if the letting agent is managing your property, then yeah, absolutely, they should be the one maintaining and updating your database for you. But sadly, we are a little light on information to answer that question directly for you, I'm afraid. So back to landlord redress. The thing that I found interesting about landlord redress is the word may was all the way through this particular section of the bill. So it may come into effect, it may not. Nothing seems to be as clear as the database for the property. But what it does say is if it comes in, maybe not, before a property can be marketed, the landlord must be a member of the redress. You can't market a property without being a member, and there is a lot of secondary legislation. So that Henry VIII clause, a lot of that to come in to follow. It was very, very sparse on landlord redress. What I was very surprised about, decent home standard. We heard a hell of a lot about this banding around in the press. Nothing in the bill at all, not even a whisper. So we assume decent home standard. It's either out of the window or it could be coming along in its own little set of legislation. Who knows, but that's gone. Okay, I have another question. Lizzie, will this be the same for HMOs? So each spare room ad, for example, will have to be on the database. Yes, absolutely. It will apply to every type of letting that the new assured tenancy is based on. Sorry, I've been talking too much today. So yes, even HMO rooms, if you're advertising a room individually, the whole property itself will need to be on the database. Whether they then break that down into individual rooms to advertise with its own unique number, again, we were a little sparse on that. However, definitely the whole property as an HMO would need to be listed, yes. Yeah, Melinda, I know, no decent home standard was shocking to me too. I was really expecting to see something detailed about that. So let's look at the timelines of all this going through. So obviously the bill was presented to Parliament yesterday. Today it's having its second reading. From its second reading, it then works through all of these stages in Parliament, the committee stage, report stage, third reading. Then it moves to the House of Lords. They have a couple of readings. Then it moves to committee stage. They have a go at it. Then it moves to final stages. And then it eventually gets royal assent. Only once it gets royal assent will it become an act and it will become law. Only at that point. So everything we're talking about today is a possibility. It is not law yet. It's not come in. It's got to go through all of these stages. The reason why I'm showing you this is because I just need you to understand that we still have time. It's not going to happen overnight. And even if they do whiz it through Parliament like they did with the Coronavirus Act, it's still not going to be that quick. I expect, and this is only my personal assumption, that we'll see this become law in the spring of 2024. How many years down the road will this happen? We're talking months. We are talking months with regards to how long this is going to take. I mean, like I say, I expect it to be in the House of Lords by maybe August, September. Committee stage, then obviously we break for purdah. Final stages and royal assent, I would expect to be in the spring of 2024. That's just my professional opinion. Whether that's actually what's going to happen, I don't know. It might take longer than that. Look at the Renters Reform Bill, for example. That got royal assent and it took 6 years before it actually became law. So who knows is the answer to that one. So transition for existing tenancies. Now this, I think, is probably quite important, because what we're worried about is when this eventually does become law, however far down the road that is, what will happen to tenancies that we currently have? So what we do know is, as with all new legislation that we have, is it is immediate for all new tenancies entered into on the day that the bill becomes law. That's obvious because it's happening in that time frame. So any new tenancy that's signed on or after the bill becoming law, it applies to that particular tenancy. Now, existing tenancies are slightly different. If you have a fixed term tenancy, the new law won't apply until that fixed term runs into its natural periodic. So if you've just signed a 12-month fixed term, you're not going to be affected by this new legislation until 12 months down the line, when your fixed term becomes periodic. Now, if you've got a fixed term that's only a couple of months away from periodic, then you're going to be affected a little bit quicker. Existing notices that have been served. So if this bill comes in January next year and you've served a Section 21 in December, don't worry, your Section 21 remains valid. It remains valid until you've used it or it expires. Now, what I mean by expire is a Section 21 has a shelf life. That shelf life is 6 months from the date of service. So the date you issue it to the tenant, you give 2 months notice. That leaves you 4 months to go to court until it just voids itself and disappears. So you have a 6-month shelf life on a Section 21. So if you issue a Section 21 before this new law comes in, you'll always be able to use it until either you've used it and gone to court or it's run out in that 6 months. So what I'm going to move on to now is the grounds for possession. These have changed quite dramatically. So we know that we don't have Section 21 anymore. And what's really important is to understand what's going to take its place and how landlords can utilise this new Ground 8 grounds for possession to get their property back. So what is clear is we're only going to have Section 8 now. That's it. That's all we've got. It will be in prescribed form, as it already is. Section 8 notice must be in prescribed form, but a new version is currently being drafted by the Secretary of State. We will continue to have mandatory and discretionary grounds. So mandatory means a judge has got no option but to award possession as long as everything has been issued in the correct way. Discretionary means it's up to the judge on the day to decide if possession is reasonable. Now I'm going to move through the grounds that have been issued, and what I've done is put a little code next to them so we know if they've been altered or not. An EX means they're an existing ground. We've already got it. N means it's a brand new ground that's been brought in with this this bill. And A means it's a ground that we've already had, but it's been amended in some way. Now, this particular bill also includes the registered providers of social housing. I'm not going to focus on them heavily today because I don't genuinely think I've got many registered providers of social housing on. But if anybody wants more detail on that specifically, drop me a line or something like that and I can go through it in a bit more detail. But again, please remember, this is the first draft of the bill. It could all change. So let's move forward to see what we've got. So ground 1, mandatory grounds. So the first 8 grounds, so grounds 1 to 8 and all the little bits in between, are mandatory, all of them. Ground 1 is an existing ground. We've always had it, and that's the property is required for the landlord or a family member to move into. Now, this has been amended. And this is a notice that cannot be given until at least 6 months of the tenancy have passed. Now, remember, with this new bill, we have periodic from day one, so there's no fixed terms to worry about. So tenant's got to be in the property for 6 months, then you can issue notice. The landlord needs to move back in or a family member. So literally, as you can see on the screen, family member is quite a large range of human beings that want to be able to move into the property. Now, the caveats of this, if the landlord uses this particular ground to evict a tenant, the landlord cannot relet or allow an agent to market the property for let for 3 months after the tenant has vacated. This is basically to stop landlords using this as an excuse. Oh yeah, my sister's going to move in. Obviously, sister doesn't move in. They remarket it for a higher price. That's basically what it's here to stop. This also applies if the tenant leaves of their own accord after receiving the notice rather than having to go through the court process. This particular ground is 2 months' notice, as it always has been. We have a new ground, ground 1A. Landlord wants to sell the property. Again, notice can't be issued until 6 months of the periodic tenancy have passed. The landlord can't relet or allow an agent to market the property for 3 months after the tenant has vacated, even if the tenant leaves of their own accord after the notice. This again is a 2 months notice. So you can see here, this is one of the ones that is trying to replace Section 21, because a landlord wanting to sell would have been a valid reason for Section 21, not the tenant's fault. And again, it's the 2 months notice we would have expected from Section 21. Ground 1B is a new ground, and that's exactly the same as 1A, but that's specifically for the registered providers of social housing. So I don't need to expand on that. Ground 2, again, we've always had ground 2, but it has been amended. And this is if the lender, the mortgage requires possession. So it used to be that the landlord had to give a notice to the tenant before they moved in to say that there is a mortgage on the property. And should the landlord default, the mortgage provider may want possession. That bit has been scrapped, and it's been amended to if the lender requires possession to sell, or the lender no longer required to accept existing tenancy and can force vacant possession. So this could apply if you are looking for your first buy-to-let mortgage and you're relying on an existing tenancy in the property. Mortgage companies no longer have to accept an existing tenancy if they don't want to. They can force you to vacant possession before they lend. And the same if they are repossessing your property because you haven't paid or you've defaulted. It used to be that the lender could quite easily accept the tenant as their own and move forward. Now the lender can force vacant possession before they take possession themselves. Again, this is 2 months' notice. Couple of new grounds here. Ground 2ZA, valid notice served by a superior landlord. Again, this is predominantly for registered providers of social housing, where there's a block of flats, for example, maybe the superior landlord wants the property back or something along those lines. Again, 2 months notice. And ground 2ZB, the landlord becomes a landlord by virtue of Section 18 of the Housing Act 1988. Now, this is usually where a landlord of a leasehold property. So technically the landlord is a tenant in his own right because it's leasehold. Notice has been served on him to become the new landlord. So the freeholder has given him the permission to be the new landlord. This has happened no more than 6 months before the possession is commenced. So if this has happened 18 months ago, the landlord can't rely on this clause. But if it's something that's just happening within the 6 months, then the landlord can rely on this clause. The previous landlord was a registered provider of social housing. So these are ors. So either no more than 6 months has passed, the previous landlord was a registered provider of social housing, or 50% owned by local authority. So that means rent to buy. And again, 2 months notice on that. So ground 3, which is an existing ground that we currently have, which was the property was let as a holiday accommodation. That's been put in the shredder. We don't have that anymore. That's scrapped. Ground 4, existing ground. Property was previously let by an educational establishment to a student. That stays. That hasn't been amended, and that's 2 weeks notice. Ground 5, again, existing ground, hasn't been amended, and that's for the property for use of a religious minister. So that usually where a church has, let's say, rented out a property that they'd normally use to put the vicar in, but they haven't had a vicar for so many years, so they've been renting it out privately. Now they've got a vicar, they can use this ground to evict the tenant so that they can move the vicar in, and this one is 2 months' notice. So remember, all of these are still mandatory. So as long as issued correctly, judge has got no choice but to issue the eviction. New ground, 5A, property required for seasonal or permanent employer of the landlord. So this is mainly to do with agriculture. We probably won't see this a lot as private landlords ourselves, unless we are looking at property where there might be, say, farm or even vineyards. There's one in Hemel Hempstead where they have a residential property. They let out one of the annexes, and that particular person then works on the vineyard. So this would apply in this case if the property is required for that seasonal worker or a permanent employee to move into. The current tenant doesn't fit that bill, so they could be given 2 months' notice. And the same ground applies to registered providers of social housing. Ground 5C, another new ground. Well, it's not really new. This was actually our existing ground 16. It's been promoted from discretionary to mandatory and given a new name of 5C. So this was where the landlord is an employer of letting a property for work. So we used to call this tied accommodation. So this would be along the lines of if you've got a pub and the pub landlord lives on the premises, maybe the flat above the pub or something like that, and that employment has ceased. So this used to be ground 16. It's been promoted to 5C, 2 months' notice. And again, the same ground for registered providers of social housing, where you'd maybe it's a caretaker or somebody like that would probably apply in this particular situation. 5E, new ground, landlord requires property to let as supported accommodation. I was really surprised to see this ground. So what this means was the property must have been held for that purpose. So what that means is the landlord should have already had it in his plan that this property was going to be used for supported housing or supported accommodation. Whilst he was getting all his ducks in a row to do that, he rented it out privately. The particular tenant that's currently in the property doesn't meet the requirements of supported accommodation, so the landlord can evict. And this is a 4-week notice. We've seen an introduction of 4 weeks. We haven't seen that before. We've usually had 2 weeks or 2 months. So 4 weeks notice is a new introduction. Mandatory ground 5F, brand new ground. Again, more to do with property was for supported accommodation. But this is if the tenant that was in the property did require the supported accommodation, so was the right person at the time, but that support was time limited. So let's say you're allowing somebody to live in the property for 2 years whilst they work through a program with you to help them then move on to their own settled accommodation, and that timeline has now finished. You can use this ground. The service provider contract has come to an end. So that could mean if you have a company or a charity or an organisation providing your service supported accommodation, their contract comes to an end, you can't find another suitable provider, you can use this ground. If the supported accommodation is funded in any way and that funding was time limited and the funding has come to an end and you can't find or secure new funding, you can use this ground. The tenant no longer needs that particular level of support. The support no longer meets the tenant's needs. The property's physical features are unsuitable for the tenant. So this could be if the tenant maybe has become more poorly, or maybe they've had an accident and the particular property that you have no longer is suitable for them. Maybe it's not got the right adaptations, so you can use this ground. And again, for an adapted property, if the current tenant doesn't require those adaptations. All of those reasons under this new ground of 5F, and that is 4 weeks notice as well. So we're still on mandatory. We haven't even got to discretionary yet. Ground 5G, New ground, property was required under homelessness duty. So what we have seen in the past is a lot of local authorities will discharge their duty into the private rented sector. So people who are owed a duty under the homelessness legislation have been given tenancies in the private rented sector. Now, a landlord can use this ground if the tenant no longer requires that property, or no more than 12 months after the tenancy has started, did the local authority advise the landlord the property was no longer needed. So again, not an awful lot of detail on this, sadly, in the bill. And we expect, again, secondary legislation to come in and bulk that out a bit. But that's all we've got at the moment, and that's a 4-week notice. So this is an existing ground which has been amended, which was ground 6, and that was if you needed to demolish or reconstruct the property in some way. So again, this notice can't be served until 4 months of your tenancy have passed, unless there is a compulsory purchase order. And if the registered provider of social housing, a superior landlord, or a common hold association is a requirement of needing that property back to reconstruct or demolish. Again, not a lot of detail on this, and 2 months notice to the tenant in this case. Another new ground for us: to allow compliance with enforcement action. Now, this is in case a landlord is breaching a banning order, an improvement notice has been put onto the property, there's overcrowding, an HMO license has been applied for but refused, an HMO license has been revoked. For all of those reasons, a landlord can issue Section 8, Ground 6A, giving 2 months notice to the tenant, and that allows the landlord to then comply with any enforcement and compliance action that they've been given notice of. So that's new. Still on mandatory, Ground 7. Again, this is an existing ground, but it has been slightly amended. So this is if your tenant passes away. So if your tenant dies within the tenancy, it used to be that you had to apply this ground and apply for possession within 12 months of the death of the tenant, or you knowing the tenant has died. The only amendment here is that's been doubled in time. So you've now got 24 months from the death or notification of the death, and that's 2 months notice. Ground 7A and Ground 7B are existing grounds. One is if the tenant is convicted of a serious offence, and the other one is if the tenant fails the right to rent, and that's 2 weeks notice. Neither of those have been amended. Ground 8, this is the one we probably all know the best, which is for rent arrears. This is existing, it's stayed. Tenant's got to be 2 clear months in arrears. What has been added into this is that if the tenant is in receipt of benefits and the rent arrears have built up because the tenant has not received their benefit. So let's say if they've just applied for universal credit, the 5-week waiting period means they've built up some arrears. You can't count that period of non-benefits because the act is saying, the bill is saying it's not the tenant's fault. So you have to be 2 clear months in arrears without allowing the benefit situation to get in the way. And again, that's 4 weeks notice. A new ground added into that for rent arrears is if the tenant has been in at least 2 months unpaid rent for several separate periods over a period of 3 years. So what that means is you could have a tenant that's got into 2 months arrears, then managed to pay it all off, then got themselves in 2 months arrears again, paid it all off, then got themselves in 2 months arrears again and paid it all off. Doesn't matter that they've paid it off. What is clear is that they have to have been in 2 months of unpaid rent for several separate sections over a 3-year period. Unlike ground 8 above, where they must be in 2 months arrears at the time you issue the notice and 2 months arrears when you go to court, ground 8A doesn't require that. But again, if they're in receipt of benefits and it's a benefit problem, not that the tenant has been paid the benefits and then failed to pay their rent. No, that's not what they're saying here. What they're saying is if DWP or housing benefit failed to pay the tenant, then you can't count that in your time period when calculating the rent arrears. So I'm just going to whiz through the discretionary grounds very, very quickly, because discretionary grounds, a lot of them have not been changed, so it's not worth expanding on them too much. Ground 9, ground 10, the only thing that's been amended on grounds 10 and 11 is it used to be 2 weeks notice, it's now 4 weeks notice, so that's just worth bearing in mind. Ground 12, ground 13, ground 14. So ground 14 used to be the one that we would use if a tenant was committing antisocial behaviour. Now, the wording in the current legislation says likely to cause nuisance, annoyance, whatever. The amended section 14 says the person is capable of causing. Now, how you kind of differentiate between the two, I don't know. I'm going to need a little bit of secondary legislation. But again, there's no notice period for that. So if you issue a ground 14 notice to your tenant at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, you can apply to the court at 9:05 on a Monday morning. There's no notice period for ground 14 antisocial behaviour. However, the amendment to this with the bill is that the courts will not give you a possession order until 14 days have passed. Ground 14 ZA existing, that's if the tenant's convicted of an offence that was caused at the scene of a riot. 14A, domestic violence. 15, deterioration of furniture. Ground 16, as I said, that's been promoted to ground 5C. And ground 17 existing, which was the tenancy was granted under false statement. That's usually something along the lines of the tenant said they were earning 60 grand a year, which meant they could afford the rent. It turns out they're on £2.50 a month and they can't afford the rent. So false statement, something along those lines, that hasn't been changed either. So the very last thing that I'm going to talk about is the very last discretionary ground that has been added. So this is new, and this is supported accommodation. Now, if you have supported accommodation and the tenant in the property is refusing that support, you can evict them using this ground, giving 4 weeks notice. Again, this is discretionary, so all the discretionary grounds are, it's up to the judge on the day to decide if eviction is reasonable. Now, that's the end of what is in the bill as it is now. But what I will say to you is it could all change. The bare bones that I spoke about at the beginning of this presentation, the abolishment of Section 21, the abolishment of fixed term tenancies, those won't change. They will stay 100%. But a lot of the stuff that I've talked about, the property database, the landlord redress, a lot of those things could change quite drastically as we move through all the different processes in Parliament, and they have their different readings. People, the politicians get to have their own consultations on it. So we could see it watered down, we could see things removed, we could see things added in. But this is just where we are today, and I'm sure after the second reading, we might know a little bit more clearer what we're going for. So if anyone's got any questions, like I say, please pop them in the chat box. I've got a question now from Matt. One problem, as I understand it with existing Section 8, is that it just takes way too long and at a cost to get the judge to award eviction. Hence, Section 21 was the quickest and simplest way to regain possession. I agree. I thought the new Section 8 was not going to rely on waiting for a judge, but would be via a new ombudsman. Is that not the case? No, it isn't the case. So this was one of the things that was scrapped from the white paper, the Fairer Renter white paper that we had back in June last year. We were expecting to see a dedicated housing court. Unfortunately, that's been put in the shredder. We're not going to see a dedicated housing court anymore. And basically, it's going to be back to the system that we're already using. How well that's going to work, and whether, again, it's going to be secondary legislation that may bring something in, I don't know. But sadly, yes, we will be relying on judges. There won't be a specific ombudsman that will deal with it, or a housing court. So yeah, sadly, Matt, we are kind of back to square one just with the removal of Section 21. Does anybody else have any more questions? if you don't have any more questions, then I'm more than happy to let you get on with your afternoon. And I will send everybody that's given me an email, a link to where this is. So yeah, for those of you that joined late to the party, if this is being recorded, if you want a copy of the recording, pop me your email address and I will make sure that you get a copy. Lovely. Thank you for your time, everybody. It's nice to get the information out there, but it's just nice to be prepared is the most important thing. Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody.